Hello. Today we're speaking with Minister of Foreign Affairs Wilfred Elrington, and we're discussing the current issue about the border issue between Belize and Guatemala. And we're very happy that you could be here with us today, Minister Elrington.
You're very welcome. Glad to be here.
I think a lot of people don't really, if they know about the dispute, they don't really know where it came from. So maybe you could start by just telling us a little bit about the historical background. How did the dispute start?
Okay, we'll have to go back to 1492.
Okay.
When Columbus discovered this part of the world, and shortly thereafter, Pope Alexander VI, who was a Spaniard, declared the entire Americas to be the property of Spain. Of course, that did not sit well with the monarchs in the other European countries. In fact, the French monarch at the time said that she wanted to see the clause in Adam's will, which would prevent the French from getting a share of the Americas. So what happened is that beginning in the 16th century, British sailors, who later turned out to become buccaneers and pirates, came into the Americas, and they started preying on the Spanish galleons that were transporting wealth that they had extracted from the New World to the Old World. And they would lay wait them, attack them, take away the riches that they had in there and take them back to England. As time progressed, they sought places to hide in the Caribbean and in Latin America. And then as the situation became more risky and less profitable, they started settling and started extracting logwood, which was very, very much needed for the clothing industry in the United Kingdom. It was used for dye, to dye the clothes with the cotton. And then, so they started settling and cutting logwood that grew in abundance in the Yucatan area, coming down to Belize. By this time, of course, Spain, they started initially with the permission of Spain to do this extraction of logwood on treaties which prohibited them from actually occupying the land and living on it. But as time went by, they started actually living. So by the 19th century, the 1800s, the English had been occupying from the Hondo to the Saskatoon in what is now Belize. The Hondo is the northern border, the Saskatoon is the southern border, and they had gone as far as Garbat Falls in the west. Those were territories which were originally under the Captaincy General of Guatemala for Spain.
Well, we can just keep going with the audio.
Yeah.
Can they edit that, or can they edit the audio and just keep on going? Okay.
So yeah, just carry on.
Okay.
Yeah. And then when Guatemala became independent after the breakup of the Central American countries, you remember there were 6 of them. When they broke up El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala claimed that Belize, the territory of Belize, had fallen under its jurisdiction, and that it had inherited Belize from Spain. That is a claim that it made. In the 1850s, they had negotiations with the British, and the Guatemalans begged the British, who had continued to move westward, to enter into a border treaty with it, to separate territory which was clearly British territory from Guatemalan territory. And so in 1859, a treaty was entered into between the British and Guatemala, at the insistence of Guatemala, to establish the boundaries between Belize and Guatemala. And that was done in 1859. The boundary treaty was entered into. And that treaty was, in fact, reaffirmed by exchange of notes in 1931. An actual survey had begun between the two countries. Commissioners of surveys between the two countries had agreed upon the work to be done, and it had actually been started, and markers were located. I think there were about 3 markers were put down. So that there is a clear treaty and there were clear markers. Boundaries were articulated in the treaty. However, one of the clauses of the treaty, Clause 7, provided that both countries would use their best efforts to cause a cart road to be built from Guatemala to the Caribbean. That cart road was never built for one reason or the other. And the Guatemalans in 1937 sent a letter to the British. Of course, after negotiating and talking, sent a letter to the British in 1939, in the height of the war, Second World War, saying that they would be repudiating the convention, the boundary treaty, the boundary convention, that's what they call it, because the British had failed to comply with the provisions of that Article 7, which talk about the cart road. Of course, the British denied that, in fact, that would give them the right to repudiate the boundary treaty, and invited them to take the matter to the ICJ. The Guatemalans resisted. In 1948, they agreed to go to the ICJ, but not strictly on law, but on the principle of ex aequo et bono. The British said no, we will go strictly on the basis of law. And between 1948 and 2008, they resisted, the Guatemalans resisted. Although there were several negotiations taking place, the Guatemalans resisted to take the matter to the ICJ until 2008, when I signed an agreement, special agreement with the Guatemalan foreign minister to take the matter to the ICJ. So that is going apace now. The requirement for having the matter to be settled at the ICJ is that the populations in both countries, Belize and Guatemala, must indicate in a referendum that they want to have the matter resolved at the ICJ. The Guatemalans have agreed to go to the referendum in April of this year, a few months' time. That is their plan, and they said they are well along the way in executing that plan. For various reasons, we cannot go until later on in this year, maybe the last quarter, because we are going to municipal elections in March, I think. And then right after that, we have to do a new re-registration exercise. We have got to construct a brand new electoral roll that is required by law. And it is only after we have done that that we ourselves will be able to go to referendum to have the matter dealt with at the ICJ.
Did the Guatemalan position change when Belize became independent?
Not really. They had some reluctance. They opposed, of course, or going to independence, but we had the full backing of the United Nations, and the United Nations ordered that we had to be brought to independence by 1981, and the Guatemalans couldn't stop that. So they did not recognize us, of course, until 1990. So now they recognize us as a sovereign independent nation, but they have difficulty with respect to the boundaries. So as to resolve all issues with them, because they claim that in 1939 they repudiated the 1859 Convention or Treaty. If in fact that is a valid repudiation, we contest that. We are saying the repudiation is not valid. It's not. But if it is in fact a valid repudiation, then it would put into question the entire boundary of Belize. Not that Guatemala would be able to claim it as theirs, because at no stage did they occupy the territory which is now known as Belize. They never did. Neither did Guatemala, nor did Spain. They are suggesting in their argument that the 1859 treaty was a treaty of cession, that they had ceded Belize at that time to England.
So they're saying it was a quid pro quo,
Yeah,
like we
that
let
was
you have
never the
this
case.
land because you
Yeah.
gave us this.
That was never the case.
Okay.
That was never the case. It was simply a question of demarcating the boundaries, because you will recall that at that time in history, the British were perhaps the most powerful nation on earth. The Americans were quickly reaching that point, but British was still powerful, and because their citizens kept on moving more and more into territory that was actually being occupied by Guatemala, and they were fearful that the British settlers would take territory that they thought was theirs.
So from their perspective, the treaty was designed to stop the Brits from moving further west.
They needed to establish where the British territory ended and where they began. And so that, to my mind, was the motivation for their urging the British to have the treaty concluded with them. Of course, the British wanted the treaty to be concluded as well, because they regarded Belize as theirs. And so that is the situation.
Does Great Britain play any role anymore?
No, basically they say they're taking an even-handed approach. So they regard the matter as really a matter between Belize and Guatemala, and to the extent that they make any intervention in the process moving towards the ICJ, they want to treat both Belize and Guatemala in the same fashion. If they assist Guatemala in any way or fashion, they want to assist Belize in the same way or fashion.
Is there any sort of lingering liability on the UK's part for having not built the initial CART road in 1859?
The articulation of that clause 7 was so vague that they don't regard themselves as having a legal obligation. The terms of the provision was that both parties would use their best efforts to cause a road to be built linking Guatemala City with the Caribbean. But that is such a vague expression. What does it really mean? And what obligation does it give to each country? So that's a problem. So the British are not of the view that they owe anything to the Guatemalans.
What role has the regional superpower U.S. played in this, if anything?
The U.S. basically is a hands-off position. They are not really involved. Neither is Mexico. They are looking at what is going on, and their interest is to make sure that peace continues to prevail in the region and between our two countries, but they are not actively involved. The process is being presided over by the OAS at the request of both our countries. So we have the assistance of the OAS, the good officers of the OAS. The European Union is very, very active in helping us. In 2005, we had agreed to confidence-building measures which involve the establishing of an OAS office at the border area. The Guatemalans refused to negotiate with us if we call the area the border area. They wanted us to call it the adjacency zone. So we have the line, which is originally the boundary line, being the midpoint, the midline, and then 1 kilometer to the east is Belize adjacency zone. 1 kilometer to the west of that line is Guatemala's adjacency zone. So we have an adjacency zone of about 2 kilometers. And that is to ensure that the risk of our people coming into contact with the Guatemalans and any conflict developing is minimized.
So the OAS and the other groups that are there are sort of like observers to make sure nobody...
to make sure that nothing goes awry, that the peace prevails. And also to the United Nations is keeping a close watch on what is happening. And they have actually approved assistance to us in holding our referendum. So we're getting assistance both from the OAS and from the United Nations in our preparations for the...
And are these observers, I mean, what do they do? Is it like peacekeeping troops? You see about the blue helmet?
No. There are no peacekeeping troops. We have not had any hostilities to warrant that. There are no peacekeeping troops. What we do is we have a small group, I don't think it's more than about 3 or 4 people, who would do surveys and verifications when there is any incident between Belizean and Guatemalan citizens, Belizean security personnel and Guatemalan. Like a year or 2 ago, we had the death of a young man. You'd have the OAS would be the first responders to go and verify what transpired. That is what they do. And also, too, they have a program there where they work with the neighboring villages, particularly Guatemalan villages, to help the kids to alleviate their own economic situation and to try to get them attuned to the idea that they have to live in peace and harmony with Belizeans who are on the border.
And along that line, in the absence of an agreement on the border, how would you describe trade, diplomatic, other, business-type relations between Belize and Guatemala?
Well, on the western border, the adjacency zone area, we do have a written agreement which provides for confident building measures, and that is going apace. But we also have with Guatemala formal partial scope agreement for trade, and then we also executed with them some 13 agreements in various areas dealing with, for example, the educational relationship between us, relationship dealing with the theft of vehicles, relationship dealing with documentation that the kids would use in school and that kind of thing, Those measures which allow us to resolve problems that would crop up from day to day because of the interaction that takes place. There's a very active interaction between Belizeans and Guatemalans all along the border. For example, we have Guatemalan children at the primary school level and the secondary school level who come across to Belize every day, where they are educated free of cost. They also have an active activity between Guatemalan investors and Belizean farmers, where the Guatemalan would provide funding for the Belizeans, and then they would farm and sell all their products to Guatemala. You have a thriving informal trade between the Mennonites in particular and the Guatemalans, where a lot of the cattle that is produced in Belize is sold, a lot of the beans and corn that is produced in Belize is sold. So the relationship is very dynamic between the two countries. We don't have a problem with that. Down south in the Saskatoon, we don't have a protocol to deal with incidents involving the Saskatoon. Half of the middle channel of the Saskatoon River divides Belize from Guatemala. So
that's a river with an island
that's
for
the
people who...
southernmost, and so this northern half of that river belongs to Belize. The southern half belongs to Guatemala. We have a military station that is at the end of the river, one of the western point in the river, and our military people have to go there every week to refurbish, re-provision their military posts, and so they go there on a weekly basis. There are times when they are shadowed by the Guatemalans. There are times when they have little tense moments, but that has been done certainly since our independence. We have to go up there because that's the southern boundary, and we do have military personnel there.
I mean, realistically, there's no fear for Belizeans or foreigners living in Belize that Guatemala would invade or come across the river or.
The last time we had a fear of invasion was 1977. Since then, we have had no fear of no threat of invasion. That is not on the cards, and because we are both members of the United Nations, aggression like that is clearly prohibited, proscribed under the terms of the United Nations Charter. So any kind of aggression like that is not going to be countenanced by anybody. And to that extent, I think the United States plays a very important role. The Southern Command, which works very closely with Belize's military as well as Guatemala's military, help to ensure that that kind of thing will not be countenanced. Whenever we have tense moments, we do meet with people from the State Department and who help us to ensure that peace prevails and that we have a harmonious relationship, military to military.
You mentioned both the UN and before the OAS. Are there other regional organizations like CELAC, also called GRULAC, or CARICOM that are playing any kind of role in helping to alleviate tensions?
Not any active role because, as I'm saying, we don't often have tensions elevated. Normally, the relationship is good. Normally, most times.
Do these organizations encourage both sides to, get through this referendum process and actually take it to the ICJ?
All organizations are on board. They are convinced that that is the right process. Belize is a member of SICA, in which Guatemala is also a member. So we get together very often with Guatemalan officials, presidents. When we have the summits, foreign ministers meet often and at the lower level. So we are part of SICA, part and parcel of SICA, so that we are recognized fully as an independent, sovereign-independent nation by the Guatemalans and by all other SICA countries, the other Central American countries. The same obtains with respect to CARICOM, and they are very fully supportive of our initiative to do the resolution of the matter at the ICJ. As well, CELAC is of the same view. On all the international organizations that we are members of, Group of 77, all the regional organizations, Commonwealth, United Nations.
They're all basically saying the same thing. Like,
everybody is saying the
let's
same
get this
thing.
done. Let's get
Consensus is that these border disputes need to be resolved peacefully. The proper place is the ICJ, which is the judicial arm of the United Nations. So the ACP countries, everybody support us going to the ICJ to have it resolved.
So you mentioned Guatemala is going to have a referendum. You said Belize should be on pace to have one maybe in the fourth quarter.
Yeah.
Describe the process from there. What do you see happening here going forward?
If referendums are held and the people say yes, we want to go to the ICJ, then official application, imagine claims that lawyers normally prepare, claim will be lodged at the ICJ. I imagine Guatemala is going to lodge their claim because they are the claimant. Time will be given for us to make a response, and then of course a timetable will be set for hearing of arguments. So it is imperative that we in fact seek to employ the lawyers who are specialized to appear before the ICJ to deal with that. I'm aware that both Guatemala and ourselves have in fact been in contact with their legal representatives. And I think once the matter is lodged at the ICJ, I think from all that I'm hearing, it should take some 5-6 years for the matter to be resolved. Could be earlier than that, but that is the kind of length of time that is given. And the arrangement we have, the agreement we have with Guatemala is that the ICJ will not only pronounce on the issue, but will also help to implement the decision it takes, so that we are going to have the maritime areas demarcated clearly and physically, so that we know where our boundaries are, maritime boundaries, as well as the terrestrial boundaries. So the ICJ is going to be integral in the process of getting everything regularized between our two countries, so that once they meet the scene, everything will be settled between our two countries.
So what happens if one side, Belize or Guatemala, people say no? Then what?
We are back to square one.
Both sides have to agree.
Both sides have to agree. And it's so very important for both of us. The Guatemalans have resolved that only the ICJ can properly resolve this matter, and they desperately want to get their people to say yes, the ICJ is the place to go. We have the same conviction, so we are both working hard to ensure that we will get a yes vote so that we can move forward.
I imagine there's a lot of education involved to make people understand.
A lot of education involved, a lot of endless education.
You started with Christopher Columbus, and
yeah.
I mean that's a lot of history.
1492, it's a lot of history. We do have a disadvantage because the Guatemalans beat us to the point where they have always insisted to their people that Belize es nuestro, Belize es nuestro. They had a lot of knowledge of history on the dispute. We have not been as disciplined in educating and informing our populace on the history of the dispute. So we have to be doing that now. Fortunately, our population is small, and we do have more time. The Guatemalans are going as early as April. We will have until the end of the year. So we continue to do the education exercise, and we have been doing now for a number of years. So,
like any democracy, you have political opposition. What if any opposition is there to sending this to the ICJ?
Well, the only opposition that we have, strangely enough, we have two main parties in Belize, the People's United Party and the United Democratic Party. The decision which we took in 2008 to sign the special agreement to take the matter to the International Court of Justice was actually arrived at in 2007 by the last administration, the People's United Party. They had really orchestrated this the position where the Secretary General of the OAS recommended that we take the matter to the ICJ, but they lost the election. After so doing, when we got into office, we acceded to that agreement because we thought that was the best position, so that it is fair to say that immediately after we got into office, the position of the government and the opposition was at idem. We both thought that the ICJ was the best place to go. Now the People's United Party, who orchestrated the matter in 2007, are taking the view that, yes, they want to go to the ICJ, but not while I am foreign minister. So they seem to have violent opposition to me. And so they said, yes, we think we should go to the ICJ, but not while I am the foreign minister. I don't necessarily think that that is the position of all the people in the opposition, but certainly a powerful faction in the party hold that view. But fortunately for us, the Guatemala claim is a claim that cuts across party. The Belizean people normally vote their conscience and do not vote along party lines when it comes to this issue. They see this as a matter of national importance. And so it is my own hope that that being the case, we will have the support of the Belizean people in general when the time comes for them to vote.
Now, there's a lot of both legal and illegal immigration into Belize from Guatemala. How do those movements of people affect this whole process?
Really, we have seen no discernible impact by that process on our own activities. Fair amount of Guatemalans come across the Belize. They want to live in Belize. They don't want to live in Guatemala. They choose to come to Belize, and it is our hope that, many of them will not be able to vote in a referendum, but those who are of Guatemalan heritage and who are able to vote, it is our hope that they will vote in favor of having the matter resolved. But there is no discernible position one way or the other in consequence of the migration pattern between Belize and Guatemala.
One other area I'm curious about has to do with natural resources. You mentioned before it's not only the border on land, but the maritime. How much does a natural resource issues like oil and fisheries, how large an issue is that in the greater context of solving the overall dispute?
We have not been getting any real negatives in relation to those issues. We are aware that, for example, in the case that Venezuela has with Guyana, the Venezuelan authorities have in fact sought to stop companies that Guyana has given licenses to explore for oil from operating. Guatemalans haven't sought to stop us at all. As a matter of fact, they have not sought to stop us neither on land or on the sea. The position that they have taken, as far as I'm aware, is they have given de facto recognition of the boundaries as articulated in the 1859 treaty. And the most that they have asked, which is not unreasonable, is that, well, if you're going to be doing any drilling in areas near to the border, adjacent Syria and the like, or that they be notified. And the same applies with respect to the Mexicans, because, oil doesn't respect borders. So we have not been having any real problem out in the sea. They have not been prospecting for oil there. We now have a moratorium on the exploration of oil out offshore, so that is not an issue. We do have an issue with the fisher folk fishing in our internal waters, but it has not reached the point yet where it is causing a real problem. There's still capacity to coexist without too much friction there.
What about timber? I think that's one other area here.
We had some illegal extraction of timber, but it is not overwhelming. But people come in and they do some small operations using these small sawmills, but it is not. It's disconcerting, and it's something that is worrying, because they not only extract timber, but they also cut down trees to establish milpas plantations where they plant corn and beans and things like pumpkins. That is worrying, and we try to minimize it as much as possible. The Guatemalan authorities have been doing all in their power to urge their citizens not to come across and to cut down our forests for the purposes of planting and the like. But there are still those who do come. They want to have pasture, they want to plant beans, corn, and pumpkin and the like. We're trying to contain that, but it hasn't reached a stage yet where we have any kind of violent confrontation over it. We're trying to contain it.
Minister, the last question I have has to do with, once we get to the end of the process and the ICJ makes its ruling, it would be wonderful if they, like King Solomon, could come up with a solution that made everybody happy. But assuming that they make a ruling that one side, whether it's Belize or Guatemala, doesn't really like.
Yeah.
What happens then?
Again, as I'm saying to you, because we have a treaty, two treaties, which clearly articulate what our western border is between Belize and Guatemala. Not only do we have the specific what do you call it, the articulation of the location of the boundary, coordinates of the boundaries and the like, and the actual markers in the west. But the Guatemalans have de facto respected the territory as articulated in the 1859 treaty. Now the legal position is that once a treaty is established, it will always be a treaty. In other words, once a boundary is established, it's always going to be a boundary, irrespective of what the courts decide. If they follow the law, as they always do, the boundary on the west is going to remain as articulated in the 1859 treaty. So that the only area we expect some change, if any, will be in the maritime areas. We have not been doing much in the maritime areas generally. You know, the economic zone that we have, the exclusive economic zone and the like, we have hardly utilized it. But our fear is that the only place that they can make some adjustment would be in the maritime area. We do not, given past experience with the Guatemalans, anticipate that they are going to create any problem with that decision and determination. But if they created a problem, our only resort would have to be to the United Nations Security Council. But we have the assurance that the ICJ will in fact work with us to do the implementation of their decision. And if there is any untoward situation, I think we'll have to rely on the good offices of the United States and, of course, the Security Council in the final resort. But we don't get the sense that the Guatemalans are going to raise a problem once the matter is resolved. Because, as I'm saying to you, they have, by and large, over the 100+ years, observed de facto boundaries. They have not sought to impinge upon it in any real way.
So essentially, this is just taking what's been the accepted practice and then making it the hard law.
Yeah, we're trying to formalize what is in de facto the situation on the ground.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Minister. We appreciate your time. You've taken what's a rather difficult and complex issue and made it very simple for all of our attendees and readers to really understand, get a lot of questions about it, and thank you for taking the time to join us and explain it to us. Thank you.
Very welcome. Very welcome.